Immersed to the waist in this ruddy spring, which has been the scene for 5,000 years of so much passionate crudelty, it is not strange that Mr. Geard, whose animal magnetism was double or treble that of an ordinary person, should find himself able to tap a reservoir of miraculous power. No sacred pool in Rome, or Jerusalem, or Mecca, or Thibet has gathered such an historic continuum of psychochemical force about it as this spot contained then and contains still. But Mr. Geard did not confine his reservoir of healing power to what this locality had stored up. He wrestled at this moment with the first cause itself. Now it can be understood why he chose a day so damp and dark and windless, so brown, so neutral, so apathetic, so heavy with drowsy mists for his grand experiment. It was because, led by an instinct which he himself could never have explained, he wanted to get into touch with the first cause itself, uninterrupted by the dynamic energy of the sun or earth, or any subordinate power. The man was now like an athletic of some kind as he stretched out his arms and concentrated his massive and mountainous energy. This reminds me of when Abraham wrestled with God. And you know, of course, that Israel means to wrestle with God. So it's a little callback to the Bible here. The curious thing was that his mind remained perfectly calm, clear, and quiet. It was always rare for Mr. Geard to lose his sang-froid, even at the most culminating crisis. And he was now quite coolly saying to himself, "If I do it, I do it. If I don't do it, I don't do it. And the woman must die. But I shall do it. I feel it in me. I feel it in me." What Mr. Geard or whatever, kept his mind steadily upon, all this while, was that crack, that cranny, that slit in time, through which the timeless, known in those parts for 5,000 years as a cauldron, a horn, a crater, a muse, a well, a kernis, a platter, a cup, and even a nameless stone, had broken the laws of nature. What Mr. Geard really did, being more practical and less scrupulous than Sam Decker, was to associate the immemorial fetish with the absolute, with its creative as distinct from its destructive energy. Sam, in his passion for the crucified, opposed himself to the first cause as something so evil in its cruelty that a man ought to resist it, curse it, defy it, and have no dealing with it. Thus, in his loathing of the evil in God, Sam, the saint, refused to make any use of the beneficence of God. And this refusal was constantly handicapping him in his present all-or-nothing existence. Mr. Geard, on the other hand, was prepared to make use of this ambiguous emperor of the cosmos without the slightest scruple. Mr. Geard now happened to catch the sound of a peewit's cry, a sound that was one of his favorite bird calls, for he associated it with a certain particular fields on the road from Montacute to Yeovil, and he regarded it, reaching his ears at this crisis, as a most blessed omen. Simultaneously with this cry, which was not repeated, he noticed, to his intense satisfaction, that Titty Petherton was yawning. "I've done it," he said to himself, and straining every nerve of his nature, body and soul together, he forced himself to envisage that cancer as something towards which he was directing arrow after arrow of blighting, withering, deadly force. "The great thing is to see it," he said to himself, while his black eyes, now alight with their most burning fury, stripped the poor woman of every stitch of clothing. His arrows of thought now became a spear, the bleeding lance of the oldest legends of Carbonek. And with an actual tremor of his upraised, naked arms, he felt himself to be plunging this formidable weapon into that worst enemy of all women. "I've done it," he repeated for the second time as he saw Titty's eyes begin slowly to close. And then Mr. Geard shivered and his teeth began to chatter. Perhaps he wouldn't have succeeded after all if there hadn't come into his head at that moment an actual vision of one tiny living tendril of that murderous octopus under the sleeping woman's flesh. With one terrific upheaval of the whole of his massive frame, its gastric, its pulmonary, its spinal, its phallic force, and even lifting itself up on tiptoe from the gravel at the bottom of the font, he plunged that bleeding lance of his mind into the half-dead's cancer. Then he bowed himself forward like the trunk of a tree in a great storm, till his forehead touched the surface of the water. From that surface he proceeded to gulp down a long, panting, gurgling gasps, enough water to satisfy the thirst of the questing beast. "Blood of Christ!" he spluttered, and it was the first time during this great struggle that his favorite expression had crossed his lips. And then his former utterances escaped once more from the depths of his throat, like a veritable grunt of that questing beast. And almost inarticulately the words rose from the chalybeate water. "I've done it!" sighed Mr. Geard for the third time. He now scrambled out upon the new stone slabs, took one quick, complacent glance at the foundations of the Saxon arch, and began hurriedly drying himself. For this purpose he used, not his grey flannel shirt, as anyone would have expected, but a new black woolen waistcoat which Megan had just finished knitting for him. When he had got all his clothes on, including his thin black overcoat and a sort of low church parson's hat, which was his favorite headgear and which he now squeezed low down over his forehead, he lifted up the sleeping woman very carefully in his arms and carried her out between the pedestals of his arch. It was Crummy who had dressed Mrs. Petherton for this great excursion, certainly the most important she would ever make, till the young men, as the scriptures would put it, carried her out for her burial. And Crimmy had found an old purple bonnet in a cardboard box, which she had placed on her head, tying the strings around her neck. For Mr. Geard's fingers, spread out now under the woman's back, this hat now dangled by one of its purple strings, flapping against his knees as he carried her down the hillside. Bloody Johnny's 3 attendants hurried anxiously to meet him, and great was their relief, shared to the full by Mr. Lou, as the cheerful tone in which he greeted them. While this momentous event was occurring upon Chalice Hill, a certain young man, who was a newcomer in the town and had only recently opened a lawyer's office in High Street, was talking to Mary, the curator, and to Mr. Shepherd, the policeman, on a bench in the little gravelly courtyard outside the museum. This young man's name was Paul Trent, and the impression he produced upon sensitive people was that he ought to have been endowed with a less brief and less masterful name than this. He was indeed as silky and soft as a moth, and like a moth were his gentle movements. Brown were his eyes, with long lashes, very dark brown was his hair, while his skin was of a delicate ivory yellow, that with a faint brownish tinge in the cheeks and chin. His lips were red and full, and under lip a good deal larger than the upper lip a good deal larger than the upper, and his mouth, usually a little open, showed beautiful teeth. Taking him in all in all, there was something warm, feline, and caressing about this man, and a certain air, too, for all his gentleness and quietness, of being a Tartar, as they say, to meddle with or provoke. He gave the impression, which was not entirely erroneous, of coming from some region bathed in constant sunshine. He had been called once, by an antiquarian friend, Phoenician-looking, but there seemed to be more of the sun in his complexion than of the sea, and an ordinary person would have thought rather of Persia in connection with him than of anything Punic. Trent was a nephew of old Mr. Merry, and it was in consequence of what the curator had been telling him for the last 6 months in regards to all the new movements in the place they decided to come and practice in Glastonbury. He had already made friends with John Crow and Tom Barter, and by their means had won for himself an entrance into the Garrett household, where his original personality had pleased Bloody Johnny so well that he had introduced him to Mr. Bishop, the town clerk. "The council ought to have its own lawyer," the mayor had remarked to Mr. Bishop. "Besides, beer is much too conservative." The mayor of Glastonbury, in the depths of his South Somerset heart, nourished a profound suspicion of all lawyers. But he had too many definite reasons for distrusting Mr. Beer to allow for few indefinite ones to prejudice him against Paul Trent. "What I haven't yet been able to find in your town, Mr. Shepherd," the sallow-faced young man was now saying, "is a good vegetarian restaurant." The Glastonbury policeman opened his left eye wide and half closed his right eye. This was not a wink, for Mr. Shepherd would have regarded that historic gesture as a confession of confederacy and roguery. Besides, he had the peculiarity of being able to retain this particular mask for as long as the precise tone of the conversation required it. Namely, the narration of something wonderful to the speaker but not wonderful to the hearer. "They eat raw turnips and such like in them places, don't 'un?" Mr. Shepherd said. "I reckon us country folks see so much of they things in daily life that us don't want to see 'un when you be enjoyin' yourselves at public house. Us likes to see a bit of good meat then, such as a labouring man, when my father was young, never saw all the year round, 'cept Squire gave a parish dinner at Christmas." It had so long been a recurrent refrain in Mr. Murray's conversation, "When my nephew Paul comes to practice here," that when he did come, and even persuaded Grandmother Cole to give up to him her famous front bedroom, looking out on the High Street, everyone was frantic with curiosity. Old Mrs. Cole had retained for 20 years a neat little notice at the door of her High Street house, which contained the words, "Front bedroom to let for a single gentleman." But the old seamstress was so fastidious in her single gentleman that this pleasant sunny retreat had become for years a sort of unusual state parlor. Mr. Barter had visited it on his first arrival, but the presence of Sis and Bert in the back room, for Barter had no love of children, would have prejudiced him against the place even if the austere morality of the old lady had not been so apparent. But my nephew from the Scilly Isles, as Mr. Murray always called Paul Trent, seemed to have no fear of either children or morality. And something about the long-nosed young man, perhaps his mania for elaborate ablutions in absolutely cold water, perhaps his passion for seedling and window boxes, perhaps the unbounded respect in which the whole town held his uncle, had induced Mrs. Cole not only to give him her front room in trial, till I see where we stand and how he feels, but to let him retain it indefinitely. But if the old Glastonbury policeman had opened his left eye when he was questioned about this vegetarian restaurant, he positively gasped at the next remark of my nephew from Scilly Isles. "Are there any philosophical anarchists, uncle, in this town of yours?" "Bless me, tut! You don't mean to say you have those notions in your head still, Paul?" "No, I should say not. I should think not. Wouldn't you, Mr. Shepherd?" But the old policeman was too dumbfounded to be more than open his right eye as wide as his left. "Of course, I'm the same as I always was, uncle. You ought to know that. I wouldn't have come here if you hadn't told me so much about this new mayor and his municipal factory." "But Mr. Garrett isn't an anarchist, Paul, is he, Mr. Shepherd?" The policeman spat on the gravel of his feet. His expression seemed to say, "I can't answer for those harum-scarum officials of recent date. I know that when I first joined the force, young men would not dare to talk so wildly. Haven't you ever been seen an anarchist before? Paul Trent inquired point blank of the horrified officer. I heard Dickory Cantles say, replied Mr. Shepherd, that his grandfather served drink to a charitist once, and was mentioned by name for such doing in a sermon at St. John's. I met John Beer in the square this morning, Paul, interrupted Mr. Merry, in order to change the topic, and he asked me about you. I thought he would be crusty about you being made the council's legal adviser, but he spoke quite nicely about you. He told me that Mr. Spear from Bristol was in town again and staying at Cantles, though not in the same room as his wife. Angela, he told me, has made great friends with Mrs. Spear. The old policeman looked up sharply. Thick Spear be a Russian spy, he murmured. Leastways, that's what they tell I down at Michael's bar. But I can't vouch for it, ye understands. Talk of the devil, cried Curator Merry, for at that moment Dave Spear, accompanied by Red Robinson, entered the courtyard of the museum. Ah, Mr. Spear, cried the old curator. We were just talking about you. How do you do, Mr. Robinson? Mr. Robinson here was one of the first to discover the vein of tin in Wookiee, Paul, about which the Western Gazette is talking so much. This is my nephew from the Scilly Isles, gentlemen, Mr. Paul Trent. Well, Mr. Merry, I think I'll be taking a step round the ruins, threw in the old policeman at this point, feeling unequal to cope with such an invasion of revolutionary persons. Don't go up, Mr. Shepherd, said Dave kindly. I don't want to disturb you, or you either, Mr. Merry. We were looking for your nephew at Mr. Bishop's office, and he told us we'd probably find him here. I'll come, murmured the moth-like young man, smoothing down his silky hair with a sunburnt hand and picking up his felt hat from the gravel. As he went off with them, his uncle could not help noticing how well his loose-fitting brown clothes suited his general personality. We wanted to see you, Mr. Trent, please, began Red Robinson, on a very important high deer of Mr. Spear's. A high deer which came to him in Bristol. Ooh, we'll find out what this high deer, that means idea. High deer. That's cute, huh? Find out what that is next time. A reading from Glastonbury. Amen. Till next time, I'll see you in Glastonbury.